what you said about you won't guarantee that you will hire someone unless you think that you found a terrific candidate, right?
I'm not looking for perfect.
Or qualified.
Okay. Okay, what if what you're looking for is not the perfect guy or woman for this town? I mean, if it's not difficult to get rid of them if they're not doing a good job. I mean, what I've been hearing is that it's really necessary, we really need this for the town to function at optimum. And yet you're saying that unless you are totally convinced, then you're not going to hire anybody, even though the town is in apparently desperate straits.
Let me say that just a slightly different way. I don't need to be totally convinced, but I need to be convinced. I'm not going to hire someone for any position in this town because the voters funded that line. That's not enough.
Or
you also have to have
a need.
a need, but you also have to have a qualified candidate.
Yeah, but if they, even a qualified candidate, if they don't work out, apparently, it's pretty easy to get rid of them and find another, more qualified candidate.
I have a suggestion. I think you ought to hire Carol over here as town administrator.
Your husband's not in the room, is he?
Is there a second?
Joel, I just have a quick question. How much is in fund balance right now?
Well, I'm not sure, but we started the year with and I have a problem with this. We started the year with slightly over $1 million in fund balance. We applied $364,000 of those dollars to warrant articles in 2015, and we have the prudent fiscal advice of reserving about 5% of our operating. So the spread that we have to work with this year is?
We have $726,074.
So that's money that we have already raised and appropriated and not spent over the last decade.
Taxpayers.
And I think that number is way too high. And I think in general the selectmen are in agreement on that. The rubber meets the road where you say, well, what's the target? And I think the target ought to be 5% of operating because that's basically the statutory advice we get now.
So why are we asking for 3% more this year if we didn't spend nearly what we got last year?
You will get to decide in February how much, if any, of that unassigned fund balance gets applied to even Article 2.
That's kind of your tactic now. You put it all, oh, it's not going to come from taxes, it's going to come from fund balance. If you could just check, because if you have money currently, our pocket's already gone.
I accept that criticism fully, and I think it is a flaw in our system.
Sneaky. I
resent the sneaky part.
It's sneaky.
I'm sorry?
It's sneaky. It's sneaky.
Really?
How would you think that?
Would you like to join the budget committee?
Good thing Trump isn't here. He's trying to throw me out.
I feel like it's a small move. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, you need to start thinking a little broader about that. Let me give you a little. You're not wrong,
no, I'm not.
except when you're talking about me.
Oh, no, I'm not wrong about that either. So that's my.
One other thing with the town administrator.
I'm actually not quite done.
Go for it.
There's two things you need to think about, Miss. One of them is fund balance, and the other is capital reserve funds. There are hundreds of selectmen in New Hampshire who believe something like what you so poorly articulated. That when money is saved from either prior years under expenditure or conscientious placement into capital reserve funds under the care of the trustee of trust funds, that money is easier to spend for the voters. I completely agree. I do not accept the challenge that is somehow deceptive or sneaky.
That's my opinion.
That is an opinion and not a very well informed one.
I'll offer my 2 cents here. I have fundamentally, I think we agree. I think if year one you budgeted $1.5 million and you only spent $1.3 million, and then the next year you budgeted 1.6 and you only spent 1.4, and this continues on and on and on, well, that tells me I'm budgeting a little bit high.
Agreed.
Right? Okay. Statutorily, we are required to do that to some degree. In other words, we can't not have enough money. That there's a statutory requirement that we end each year with some money left over.
I know that.
Yeah,
I just feel like the way it's being presented as, this seems to be a new trend ever since, everything caved in a couple years ago. Everything coming from fund balance, I think that's a poor way to add to the warrant articles, because if you're saying, we've already spent this money, so it's already gone, it's easy to throw it out there, it's easy to check the box, we already spent this, but what they don't realize is, we're taking that same amount from you this year, and we're gonna use it for something next year, really against your consent, because you're just gonna check the box again.
and I think
You're
this,
technically paying for stuff that's gonna happen next year that you don't even know about yet. That's why.
no argument. And I think you'll see a specific difference as we get into the individual warrants.
I think you should be putting this as, this is gonna come from taxation, so you have to really think, is this something we really need and we really want, because I'm gonna pay for it, starting now.
Exactly my point.
Not,
And philosophically, that's kind of where I come from. I would rather have people be able to choose from the Chinese menu
I agree.
instead of the all-you-can-eat buffet, which is what our budget is. You know?
So in some roundabout way, we came to agree.
It's still worded that way, we should change it
Yeah.
next year, I don't know, you have to figure it out.
Which is not really that misinformed.
He didn't like the sneaky word, but you know what, I know not, you know big words, I know simple words, sorry. I use simple words, they're effective, what I'm saying.
Just getting back, Joel, to the town administrator wage, somebody brought up, if that money, if we don't hire that person, that money is just in that department. It can be spent within that department if they need other things.
We could
So
spend it on gravel.
that's right.
The way I think about this is, and this is a bit of a battle sometimes with department heads, is I don't want to budget for potential emergencies. So if somebody says the transmission in the trash truck could fail in 2016, I'm not willing to budget for that. Now, I don't speak for these two guys, and I don't speak for anyone else in the world. But I do want to budget a little bit for generalized emergencies. And the way we do that is in part by saying, this is what we historically have spent in this line item, and the state gives us the authority to underspend any one of those line items and slide that money horizontally across the budget to put a new transmission in something if that's an emergency, or to buy more gravel because it doesn't spoil. It's not an obligation, we don't have to spend that money, and the fact that we have an unassigned fund balance over $1 million proves that in fact we haven't spent that money. It's yours to spend as long as we carry it as unassigned fund balance, not ours. So you will have to decide in February and March how much, if any, of that money to apply to warrant articles, including Article 2. So you could effectively use all of that money to reduce taxes by voting no on every warrant article and applying all that money to Article 2. And it would have the effect of reducing by 35% the amount of money we would have to raise by taxation in 2016. Mrs. Rowland.
Yeah, I'm not an advocate of a large fund balance either, but we have to understand that using it up all at once means that if we have a large purchase we have to make the following year, then taxes are going to go up higher. The budget committee has looked at the proposals that I believe are still of Joel's, or is this the whole select board's proposals, the warrant articles?
Just me.
Okay, so Joel's, and we don't totally agree with what they proposed, and I don't think now's the time to get into a lot of detail, but the problem is if you get that balance down terribly low, and it's not going to necessarily allow us to keep tax rates smooth, and that's the goal of the budget committee, to try to keep things so that you don't see your taxes go up and down like the seesaw, which is what's happened over the last 5-10 years or so. We're trying to work with the select board to smooth things out and to gradually spend things down by doing so.
Other comments? Do you want to go through this document by department or make some generalized remarks about particular areas of interest or expertise? I am at your service. And remember, you've got one more solid chance to change any one of these numbers by majority vote, and that's not tonight. Tonight, we're hearing what you have to say.
And maybe we could say, are there any more general comments about the executive section on page 1.
Sir?
If we have this large fund balance, and you're going to apply some portion of it to this year's warrant articles, which leaves you with 300,000, 400,000 left,
250 maybe?
350, and you're required to carry only 5% of your operating budget, does that allow you to take 150,000 or 200,000 and put the two?
It does, and you'll see Article 2 is written just like that.
And if you want to bring your fund balance down and give the people a break, then in my opinion, that's the way to do it.
Juliana?
Well, maybe just repeating what Carol said, but again, we want to be real careful with that, because what happened, what was it, 5 years ago? Tell me what that was.
3
when-
years ago.
Well, that was the aftermath, so, okay, 4 years ago, that they used all the fund balance to reduce our taxes. And that was, yeah, that's great. And then they come back the next year, and there is nothing in the fund balance to balance that off. And our taxes went sky high because we had to get certain things. We had breakdowns, we had things that we had to get. And so if you spend the fund balance all the way down, it means that if we then suddenly need something, we're paying for the whole thing in 1 year. And I don't know if Glenn has given you how it changes your taxes, but we've got to be really careful not to spend that all the way down. I do not want to see my taxes go through the roof the way they did before, when that fund balance wasn't there to help balance things out. And I'm adamant on that. We have the money to keep things balanced out this year, spending down the fund balance to a reasonable degree, but we want to make sure that next year we have the money in the fund balance to also be able to spend things down and keep things even, and the next year after that. So we can't say, oh, look at all this money we have to spend. I mean, it's like, I hope everyone is putting whatever it is into the bank for their car every single month, because it isn't that you don't have the money, you do. But at some point, you're going to be spending it on that car.
Julianne, just a point of clarification. I just brought that up because Ms. Landry would like to get rid of the fund balance, so I'm just giving her another option. But if I go back a few years, Linda and myself, and I think Gloria, were giving the selectmen a bunch of crap for spending it all to keep it level. I said it's going to come back and bite them in the ass, and it did. And so I'm not really in favor. I just threw it out as an option that that's what you could do with it. It's not my vote, because I went through the same thing you did.
I never said anything about spending it all, I just said, why are we continuing to add another big chunk on top of it? This number's growing and growing and growing, if we're not using that much money, we're budgeting too much.
I'm with
No,
you exactly.
Never said anything about spending it all, I do think everybody needs money in the bank, but I'm saying, why are we just throwing more money in there in excess if we're not gonna
Some
use it?
items automatically grow. Health insurance, fuel, you have to estimate. The fuel is dropped to the bottom now, but at one time it went through the roof. And you have to budget enough what you anticipate these things are going to be. So you always, every year you end up with a fund balance, whether you want it or not. I mean, it does increase,
It's getting bigger.
but it should, there seems to be some place where it can.
I'm gonna hop in here real quick and we get to all yours, but fund balance doesn't just come from underspend, you know? It also comes from excess revenue, you know? So there is that other side of the coin. I don't know what the breakdown is. One of them, I can't do anything about, the other one, I can do something about. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
We had about
What's next?
$59,000 in unanticipated revenue this year. Came primarily from two sources that we didn't, as administrators, we did not accurately predict. A big timber sale on the town forest that we didn't know anything about until the Conservation Commission brought us that proposal, which we approved of. And the other was a bunch of you bought nice cars that we had. Well, we took more money in by near $31,000 in car registrations than we had the year prior or the year prior to that. It was like a 6% variation that just came out of the sky. That's great, and that money does not get spent in the year in which it appears. It gets handed over to the voters through fund balance for disposition or not, as the voters choose in February and March, which is why we're here, Mrs. Rowler.
Yeah, I think the same was true last year too. We had more interest on back taxes last year.
Yeah, it was a very good year last year for interest.
Right, so the income was up, and it's hard to predict, and the bottom line is none of us have a crystal ball. And it's very tough, especially as amateurs, to try to predict, and I think, today's meeting this morning was a good example. We're trying to predict what we're gonna spend, so. The other thing too is that if you look at these warrant articles, and I'm not sure my list is quite up to date, but, rough numbers, it's about $850,000, $900,000 worth of warrant article expenditures, about half of which is going to come from the fund, or is proposed to come from the fund balance, and the rest from capital reserve funds. If we spend that fund balance down and have a couple of warrant articles next year that are major items, we're going to be in deep crap because we're not going to have any money to pay for it. It's going to be out of taxes, and the taxes will go up again.
Let's remember, though, that that is never a compulsion on the voters' part. You have the final word about whether we buy that fire truck this year or next year, not the selectmen. We get to recommend, but you get the final word. So if in a future year, the fund balance and the capital reserve funds are really, really depleted because of decisions made in prior years, you're not obliged to spend a big capital. You might be advised to do that. Juliana?
Well, some of that fund balance is unpaid taxes, so therefore, some of that money is listed as money, but if you haven't paid me, I don't have that money. So it's listed there that says we have it, but we don't have it in our hands. And as Carol or Joel just said, that isn't necessarily against us because we get the interest on that and eventually we will get those taxes. But so we need to be very careful about looking at that money, because if you don't know how much of that is taxes that have not been paid, then there's a little, there's some balls that are still up in the air.
That is correct, but they are also, regardless of whether they're liquid or not liquid, they are an asset.
They are.
And they could always be used as collateral, borrowed against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, not an optimum situation, but they are. Some people look at that as just like, well, that money is non-existent and it has no value. It's almost like a write-off.
On the other hand, you can't go in and touch it either.
True.
So
Yeah.
it is that limbo. So when people hear 739, I want to make sure they understand that we can't go in tomorrow with a deposit slip and take 739. There's a large portion of that that is not in the bank. It's still in the hands of those who are eventually going to pay us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Complicated. But it's been this way for about 275 years or so, and it's still hard to understand. But I've been doing this a while, and I begin to see the sense of it, because some of us, many of us, think that a tax rate that never changes abruptly is the optimal situation. And when we're talking about big ticket items like a fire truck or a snow plow or a roof on a couple of buildings, the only way to insulate ourselves from spiky tax rates over time is to put money away in anticipation of that. And for towns, there's two ways to do that. One of them I generally support, about 99%, which is capital reserve funds, where the voters say, this amount of money for this purpose, we're going to save it, and we'll tell you when you can spend it. The one that I don't support nearly as strongly is unassigned fund balance, because while I don't think it's sneaky, I think it's bad administration to let that number get big. But of course, in my defense, the selectmen don't get to decide how big that number gets. The voters have to do that. We get to make a recommendation, and you'll see several if we get to the warrant tonight, and you'll certainly see them in February. And the Budget Committee has prepared an alternative proposal, which I think is even more closer to a zero-based budget than what we're talking about here. So, would you like to continue with that discussion, or go on to another department? What is your pleasure? Everyone says, let's move on. What's next?
Can we discuss, I'm not saying because I want to, but I know that the selectmen have no input on elected budgets like town clerk, tax collector, elections. Is that something that the citizens, taxpayers can discuss? Is there anything that comes out of that, or is that something we skip over?
The taxpayers are free to discuss the budgets of elected officials and to modify them as they see fit. That, the taxpayers will always have the authority to do that.
But is there anything, we as selectmen, changing our selectmen's budget, can't make a recommendation. We can't change a line item for the tax collector.
That is correct.
So,
One of the differences between selectmen and the civilians is you control that budget and we don't. We don't even get to make a recommendation about it, really.
so if everybody's okay, I would recommend that maybe we, unless anybody had anything else under the executive section, maybe we, skip back to maybe page 4 and we get into, let's see, auditors, assessors, talk employee benefits, we can't really talk planning and zoning, maybe we just do a quick poll, does anybody have any? That's a really bad example because we broke it out into every group. Maybe page 5, general government.
You also have we'll give you the authority tonight to decide to focus on big dollar budgets in departments instead of these small ones. If you'd like to talk about police and highway right now, we can do that. If you'd like to continue to go through this in a systematic way, we are really at your service.
Well, since the highway department is 70% of the budget or 60% of the budget, something like that, we certainly should talk about that.
And there's one not sneaky, I'm sorry, that's not fair.
How about slippery? Try slippery.
There's one really,
How about that one?
there's one really important feature of New Hampshire budget law that says if you don't talk about it in a hearing, whatever the topic is, and I'm going to use the example of a dump truck, because we've been asked to put a dump truck on the warrant and we haven't done it. We can talk about that later. If we don't talk about it at this hearing, it cannot be introduced by either the selectmen or the voters in February. So if there's something on your mind that you think we ought to be doing that we haven't dealt with in either a budget or a warrant article, you need to tell us or you're going to be really angry in February and it's not going to be my fault. It's statutory.
Can you clarify that, so if it's on here, we still need to talk about every one of these, or
Nope.
does that count?
No. If it's printed in front of you, we're cool for February. But if there's a dump truck on your mind, that's not in here. If the police department wants a Bearcat drone, that's not in here. And we need to either talk about it.
You said it. You said it.
Okay, I said it, but that doesn't mean I'm for it. But you see what I'm getting at? Bobby, if there's something out there that anybody in this room is adamant about that we should be doing and we're not doing, and it's not on this paperwork, we gotta say it tonight, or we can't talk about it in February.